After last year's D&D OGL controversy, Paizo began retooling the second edition of its flagship game, the fantasy RPG Pathfinder, to remove its dependency on the 5e System Reference Document, or SRD. By now, all the core sourcebooks of Pathfinder Remastered have been published, and in this video, we'll take a look at the new player core. I'll give you an idea of how the entire system works, not just the differences between 2nd edition and 2nd edition Remastered, since a lot of you may be looking for D&D alternatives these days, and you might not have any experience with Pathfinder. And because a large number of RPG gamers are likely to know a little about D&D, I'll be pointing out some differences between the two games here and there, with D&D 5e as a frame of reference. If you're not familiar at all with Pathfinder, it's more or less a variant of Dungeons & Dragons, being originally based on 3rd edition's SRD. Many things about it will feel familiar if you've already played D&D, particularly the 3rd or the 5th editions. Overall, it's a crunchier take on a very D&D-like fantasy RPG, retaining some of the spirit of complexity from 3rd edition on which it was based. If you tend to like rules-light systems, this may not be for you, but if you like a lot of nuances and choices in character creation as well as some richer tactical options in combat, Pathfinder is great for that. First up, let's talk about attributes. In original 2nd edition, they were called abilities. The Pathfinder attributes are the same as in D&D, namely strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Remastered removes the old base ability scores entirely and is only concerned with what it calls attributes, which are just modifiers. The only real reason you even need base values is to get balanced odds when rolling randomly for ability scores, but Remastered just drops the option of rolling them up completely. And overall, I thought this was a nice simplification. My impression is that very few players choose to randomly roll attributes anyway, and I also suspect this might be something they decided seemed very D&D IP-ish, and so they altered it for that reason too. As you create your character, you'll get various attribute boosts, or increases, or flaws, which are decreases, from your chosen ancestry, class, and background. You'll also get 4 free boosts to apply as you want. These are just changes to modifiers. So, for example, if you start out with intelligence 0, then get 1 intelligence boost, you now have a +1 intelligence modifier. Once an attribute modifier hits +4, further boosts are considered partial, so it takes 2 boosts to move it up another +1. Your hit points are not derived from your constitution, but are granted by your ancestry and class. And speaking of ancestries, the book describes these as the culture your character hails from, so they aren't necessarily species or races. In addition to your ancestry, you have a heritage, which is basically a sub-ancestry. The book clarifies, though, that thematically, a heritage is not the same as a culture or ethnicity, though some cultures or ethnicities might have more or fewer members from a particular heritage. This seems a little bit fuzzy, though, as they described dwarven heritages as bloodlines. My impression is that the fuzziness is intentional so that you can interpret these things however you want. There are also versatile heritages, which are unique or mixed ancestries. 3 types are included in the player core, which are changeling, planar scions, and mixed. Changelings are the offspring of hags, who have not themselves transformed into hags. Planar scions are beings with a combined mortal and extraplanar origin. In the core book, this mostly has to do with fiendish and celestial lineages, basically including what were called Aasimar and Tiefling. Mixed heritages are combined mortal lines, such as elf, orc, and human. The book provides 2, Ayuvaran and Dromar. Ayuvaran have a partial elven heritage, while Dromar have a partial orc heritage. There are also loose guidelines for creating your own combinations. Like 5e, Pathfinder has proficiencies, but they come in 4 named tiers. Trained is +2, Expert is +4, Master is +6, and Legendary is +8. Separate aspects of a class move along this proficiency track independently of each other, so there isn't one across-the-board jump in proficiency across the entire class. For example, the Bard gets Expert Spellcaster proficiency at 7th level, but Light Armor Expert proficiency at 13th. Saving throws can be nuanced in this way, too. It's possible to be at the trained level for 2 of them, but at Expert for 1, as an example. In Remastered, alignments are gone. Instead, various other features deal with deities, morality, and ethical choices. Rather than a 5e-like alignment, your character can have edicts and anathema. Edicts are what the character's code or religion encourages, while anathema are things it discourages. So some edict examples are to attain victory in fair combat, to be humble, and to aid fellow travelers. Some anathema examples are kill prisoners or foes who have surrendered, fail to maintain self-control, and cause fear or despair. These are optional for many kinds of characters, though certain ancestries, classes, and organizations might encourage or even require them. They are required for clerics, for example, based on the edicts and anathema established by the god they serve. For a cleric, if you repeatedly do things that are anathema to your patron deity, you can lose magical abilities from your cleric class features. When this happens and which abilities you lose are arbitrated by the GM. You can attempt an atone ritual to get back in your deity's good graces, but it takes a day to cast, costs 20 gold times the character's level and components, and has consequences for failure on the ritual checks, with a possible permanent ban from your deity if you critically fail. There are also holy and unholy traits, which affect interactions and effects in various ways. It is common, for example, for creatures with the holy trait to have a weakness to unholy effects, and vice versa. You can generally think of it as roughly similar to a damage type, but creatures can have the trait too. All of a holy character's attacks, for example, gain the holy trait, which would trigger weakness in many monsters that have the unholy trait. Now let's talk about feats. They're a really big part of Pathfinder. You get feats to choose from for your ancestry, heritage, and class, along with general and skill feats. And there are many, many more feat options and opportunities to gain them than in 5e. And the feats you choose are a nice way to customize your character's capabilities beyond just what's in the core classes and subclasses. This does present a more complex character creation process with a certain larger burden of choice that might be unfamiliar to 5e players, but they're a great way to make PCs more unique. Many feats are similar to how class abilities work, and of course, this is especially true of class feats, but they allow for nuanced options and customization by choosing which combination of feats to go with. By way of comparison, D&D 5e's Player's Handbook has 43 feats, while the remastered Pathfinder Player Core alone has hundreds. There are a couple of ways that characters can cast spells. There are the typical caster classes, but there are also focus spells. Focus spells are not chosen from a spell list, but can only be learned through a class ability or feats. Some spellcasting classes also include focus spells, but non-caster class members can have access to focus spells too. Focus spells don't need to be prepared, and you can use a refocus activity to get one focus point back. There are also focus cantrips, which are focus spells that do not require the spending of a focus point to cast. Some characters can cast innate spells, which are similar to spell-like abilities in 5e. They have a limited number of times per day that they can be cast, but they don't use leveled spell slots. Remastered has removed the schools of magic, such as abjuration and conjuration, completely, although there is still such a thing as illusion effects. This might also have to do with cutting ties with any distinct intellectual property from 5e. The Detect Magic spell is almost identical to the original 2nd edition version, but provides no information about magical schools since they don't exist anymore. However, as with the original 2nd edition, there is an Identify Magic skill which can reveal details about magical effects, including ongoing spell effects. While magic doesn't have so-called school categories, wizards choose their arcane school, which means their learning institution at which they studied the arcane. The choice of school grants certain magical abilities. In Remastered, they've switched the wording from spell level to spell rank, presumably to reduce confusion with class levels. The spells listed in the book have many similarities to classic D&D spells, but many spells unique to Pathfinder as well. Ritual spells are a little different from 5e too. They're actual rituals, often done by several characters, usually involving multiple checks. They often take a day or more to complete, and there are consequences for failure in most of them too, as I previously mentioned with the Atone ritual. Pathfinder has things called archetypes, which are a little different than how that term is used in other RPG games. Archetypes in Pathfinder are actually a means to multiclass, sort of. They offer a system of feats from which you can construct abilities from classes that are not your primary class. It's an interesting take on multiclassing, but I'm not sure it really ends up being simpler or easier to manage in the end. But I've never actually used the mechanic while playing before, so I don't really know how it feels in use at the table. Now let's go over how combat works. In Pathfinder, you get 3 actions and 1 reaction per round. There is no distinction between a standard action and a move action. An action is an action. This means it's possible to attack 3 times in a round, but you do get a -5 penalty for the second attack and a -10 for the third. though these can be reduced by certain weapons or abilities, such as agile weapons, which change these penalties to -4 for the second attack and -8 for the third. Saving throws here are a little old school in that there are only three: fortitude based on con, reflex based on dex, and will based on wisdom. Criticals are fairly different from the way they work in 5e. In 5e, a crit is a way to get an automatic success or failure, while in Pathfinder, a crit is a degree of success that is high enough to sometimes have its own beneficial effect. This is how it works. If you exceed the DC of a check by 10 or more, that's considered a critical success, while failing by 10 or more is a critical failure. This applies to any kind of check, although it's important to note that, as the rules state, if an effect doesn't list a critical success effect, the critical success effect is the same as the success effect, and the same goes for critical failures. In combat, though, crits generally will double the damage dealt. If you roll a natural 20, you do not technically get an automatic success, but instead, your degree of success is shifted to one better than you rolled. So let's say you roll a 20 against a DC of 15, and your bonus for the check is +2. Your total is then 22, which is not 10 higher than 15. But because you rolled the natural 20, your result shifts from a success to a critical success and triggers whatever effects that would have in the situation. Likewise, if you roll a natural 1, your result is shifted down 1 degree, so it's possible to go from a failure to a critical failure this way. Damage type weaknesses and resistances come with a number attached, which is how much they reduce damage. For example, if you have a weakness 5 fire, you take an extra 5 damage when hit with fire. But if you have resistance 5 to fire, then you wouldn't take the first 5 points of any fire damage you were hit with. Dying checks are similar to 5e, but differ in some key ways. When you drop to 0 HP, you receive the dying condition with a number attached. If the attack that caused this drop was a critical success, then you get dying 2, and otherwise dying 1. On each turn, you can make what Pathfinder calls a recovery check, with a DC of 10 plus your dying condition value. So, if you're at dying 1, the DC for the recovery check is 11. If you make this check, you reduce the dying condition by 1, losing it if you reach 0. On a critical success, you reduce it by 2. If you fail this check, you increase it by 1, and on a critical failure, you increase it by 2. If you reach dying 4, your character is dead. If you take damage while you have the dying condition, this increases the dying value by 1 or 2 if the damage was the result of a critical success. If you lose the dying condition and you don't already have the wounded condition, then you gain wounded 1, which represents a lasting, complicating effect from having fallen. If you already have the wounded condition, then it goes up by 1. If you are wounded and regain the dying position, you add the wound number to the dying condition, and as mentioned already, your wounded number goes up by 1 as well. There's also a doomed condition, which can lower the maximum dying condition, for example, from 4 to 3, so that your character would be dead on reaching dying 3. Pathfinder has hero points, which only last for 1 session if not used. Each character always gets 1 hero point at the beginning of the session. You can spend 1 hero point to reroll a check, but you must use the second result. And you can spend all the hero points you have to lose the dying condition and immediately stabilize. And if you do this, you do not also gain the wounded condition. Diagonal movement in Pathfinder has a 3rd edition feel in that you cannot move freely at a 5-foot cost for every diagonal movement. The first diagonal move costs only 5 feet, but every other one after that costs 10. And this is to compensate for the advantage diagonal movement can give you against orthogonal movement. Interestingly, initiative is usually determined by rolling for perception, although there are conditional exceptions. When it comes to healing, we've got a little bit more of an old school approach in Pathfinder. A good night's sleep, for example, does not bring you back to max HP. Instead, you gain your con modifier times your character level. And now we get to the thing I found most confusing when reading over these rules, and that's the various layers to whether or not you are aware of another creature's presence. There are senses considered precise, which is basically vision, imprecise, which is basically hearing, and vague, for example, smell. There are also several conditions involved, such as observed, hidden, undetected, invisible, and so on. While I appreciate a little more crunch and nuance to how hiding and sneaking works, to be brutally honest, the distinction between all of these and how they interact with various types of senses just left me confused. I'd need to read it over another couple of times to grasp it, and even then it seems like it would feel cumbersome in play, too. This part of the game seemed more complicated to me than it really needs to be. Well, that's my rundown on the new Pathfinder player core. If you enjoyed this video, check out my rundown on Kobold Press's new game, Tales of the Valiant, linked on your screen now. I'm Dave, and thanks for watching.